The grease trap at the diner always hummed a low, steady note at 2 in the morning, a sound Harrison had learned to tune out, unlike the notification chime from his wife's phone that still echoed in his mind. Can't wait for tomorrow. Wear the red one. The screen had lit up briefly in the dark bedroom, illuminating the lie of their 8-year marriage while Savannah slept soundly, her back turned to him. He hadn't screamed. He had simply quietly put on his work boots and walked out into the freezing Ohio night, carrying a secret that was slowly turning his heart to ash. If the quiet, shattering weight of unspoken truths resonates with you, please, stay here with me. There are far more secrets hiding behind these tired suburban doors, and if you want to uncover them, don't leave the channel. The smell of old fry grease and black coffee was baked so deeply into Harrison Pemberton's skin that no amount of scrubbing could wash it away. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. Outside the large, condensation-streaked windows of Hal's 24/7 diner, the city of Cleveland lay frozen under a thin, dirty layer of February snow. Inside, the only sounds were the rhythmic scrape of Harrison's spatula against the flat-top grill and the low hum of the neon clock on the wall. He flipped a pair of hash browns, watching the oil bubble around the edges. He should be tired. He had been on his feet for 8 hours, moving between the grill and the prep station in a mindless ballet he had perfected over 6 years. But his mind was terrifyingly awake, trapped in a relentless, looping playback of the night before. Can't wait for Thursday. Wear the red dress. The text had flashed across Savannah's iPad, which she had carelessly left charging on the kitchen island. Harrison had only gone for a glass of water. He hadn't been snooping. He had never been the jealous type. He trusted his wife. He trusted the 8 years they had spent together, scraping by, trying to pay off the mortgage on a cramped 2-bedroom house that always felt a little too cold in the winter. He knew the red dress. He had bought it for her 2 years ago for their anniversary, saving his tips in a jar above the fridge for 3 months to afford the silk number she had admired in a magazine. She had worn it exactly once for him. Harrison pressed the metal spatula down onto the hash browns, listening to the sharp hiss of steam. His chest felt hollowed out, as if someone had taken a melon baller to his ribs and scooped out his lungs. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't come with broken plates or screaming matches. It came with the quiet, suffocating realization that the woman sleeping in their bed had already packed up her heart and moved it somewhere else. Savannah was a saleswoman at the perfume counter of Dillard's. She spent her days draped in a black uniform, surrounded by crystal bottles and women whose shoes cost more than Harrison made in a week. She came home smelling of vanilla, bergamot, and a growing bitter resentment for the life they lived. He had noticed her sighs getting heavier when he walked in smelling like onions. He had noticed her phone constantly flipped face down on the coffee table. He just hadn't wanted to see it. He slid the hash browns onto a thick ceramic plate, adding 2 over-easy eggs, and set it on the pass for the lone waitress, Marge, to take to a weary truck driver in booth 4. Why hadn't he woken her up? Why hadn't he stormed into the bedroom, turned on the harsh overhead light, and demanded the truth? Because Harrison was terrified. He was a man holding onto the edge of a cliff, and confronting her meant letting go. It meant acknowledging that his sacrifices, the double shifts, the burned forearms, the worn-out boots, weren't enough. So, he chose the coward's path. He chose silence. He folded the knowledge into a tiny, razor-sharp square and swallowed it. The bell above the diner door jingled, slicing through his thoughts. A blast of freezing air rushed in, disturbing the napkins on the counter. Harrison wiped his hands on his apron and looked up. Standing in the entryway, unwrapping a thick, cheap woolen scarf from her neck, was Emily, Savannah's younger sister. Emily didn't have Savannah's polished veneer. She worked the registers at the Giant Eagle supermarket 3 miles down the road. Her hands were raw from handling frozen goods, and she looked tired in a way that resonated deeply within Harrison's own bones. She walked over to the counter and sat on a stool, her eyes locking onto his. There was no casual greeting, no polite smile. Emily looked at Harrison with a heavy, piercing sorrow that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the look of someone who knew exactly how much he was bleeding, even though he hadn't shed a drop of blood. "Black coffee?" Harrison asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Yeah," Emily said softly, her gaze never leaving his face. "Make it strong, Harry. We need to talk." The fluorescent lighting of the Beechwood Place Mall was a sterile, unforgiving white, a stark contrast to the dim, grease-filtered neon Harrison was accustomed to. It was 1 in the afternoon. He should have been in bed, the blackout curtains pulled tight against the Ohio winter sun, sleeping off the grueling 9-hour shift and the heavy conversation with Emily that had followed. Instead, he stood half-hidden behind a towering display of leather handbags, his tired eyes fixed on the cosmetics department 50 feet away. He felt entirely out of place. He was wearing his heavy, faded Carhartt jacket and denim jeans that were frayed at the heels. The air around him smelled of expensive leather and polished tile, completely alien to the scent of stale cooking oil that clung to his very pores. There she was, Savannah. She stood behind a pristine glass counter filled with amber and rose-colored liquids in geometric bottles. She wore the mandatory black uniform of the Dillard's beauty department, a sharply tailored blazer and a silk blouse that draped elegantly over her collarbones. Her hair, which she usually kept tied back in a messy knot at home, was blown out into soft, voluminous waves. She looked like a stranger. She looked beautiful, expensive, and entirely out of his league. Harrison's chest tightened as he watched a man approach her counter. The man was in his late 30s, wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat and a relaxed confidence that came from never having to check a bank balance before buying groceries. Harrison couldn't hear the conversation over the ambient hum of the mall, but he didn't need to. He could read the choreography. He watched as Savannah leaned forward slightly, resting her manicured hands on the glass. She smiled. It wasn't the tired, thin-lipped smile she gave Harrison when he asked how her day was. It was a radiant, head-tilted, devastatingly bright smile, the exact smile she used to give him 8 years ago when they were just 2 kids drinking cheap beer on the hood of his used Chevy. She reached for a crystalline bottle, spraying it onto a thin white paper strip. As she handed it to the man, her fingers lingered just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The man laughed at something she said, shifting his weight, leaning in closer. The space between them shrank, thick with an unspoken, electric familiarity. Was this him? The man from the text message? Wear the red dress. Harrison gripped the edge of the handbag display. The knuckles of his rough, calloused hands turned white. He could have walked over there. He could have stepped into that halo of high-end department store light, wrapped in his cheap winter coat, and introduced himself as her husband. He could have shattered the illusion she was so desperately projecting. But as he watched her laugh again, a dark, heavy realization settled into his bones. The betrayal wasn't just physical. Savannah didn't just want another man. She wanted another life. She wanted a world where men wore wool overcoats and bought $200 bottles of perfume on a Tuesday afternoon. She despised the cramped, chilly house they shared. She despised the tight budgets and the leftover dinners. She despised him. The realization didn't ignite a fiery rage. Instead, it brought a profound, freezing stillness. He let go of the display rack. The anger was there, but Emily's words from the diner hours earlier echoed in his mind, wrapping the fury in a cold, calculating patience. Harrison took one last look at his wife, who was now writing something down on a gilded card for the man. He turned his back on the perfume counter, pulling his collar up against the chill of the air conditioning, and walked away. He walked back out into the freezing parking lot, toward his rusted sedan, carrying a grief so quiet and immense it threatened to crush him. The silence had officially begun. The scanner at Register 4 emitted a sharp, monotonous beep every time Emily dragged a barcode across the glass. It was a rhythm she usually found grounding, a mindless metronome that got her through the 8-hour shifts. But today, the sound grated against her exhausted nerves. Her feet ached inside her cheap sneakers, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the Giant Eagle seemed to press down on her temples. Emily, be a sweetheart and double-bag the wine. I don't want it clinking in the trunk. Emily didn't look up immediately. She kept her eyes on the conveyor belt, her raw, red fingers grasping the heavy, dark glass bottle of a Napa Valley Cabernet that cost more than she made in half a shift. Next came a wedge of imported brie, a box of artisanal crackers, and a small tin of prosciutto. She finally lifted her gaze to her older sister. Savannah stood on the other side of the register, looking entirely out of place among the tired mothers and weary factory workers doing their Tuesday afternoon shopping. Savannah was wrapped in a camel-colored trench coat, her hair perfectly styled, smelling faintly of the expensive perfumes she peddled. Big night? Emily asked, her voice flat. She expertly snapped a brown paper bag open, slipping the heavy bottle inside. Savannah sighed, a dramatic, airy sound. She leaned against the small check-writing counter, absent-mindedly tapping her long, manicured nails against the plastic. God, no. Just surviving. Harrison is doing another double shift at that grease pit. I swear, Em, I am losing my mind in that house. It's freezing. The plumbing makes this awful groaning noise, and he's never there. And when he is, he's just exhausted. He falls asleep in his work clothes. It's like living with a ghost. Emily paused, a container of organic raspberries hovering over the scanner. She thought of Harrison's hands, the burn scars webbing across his forearms, the permanent grease trapped beneath his cuticles. He worked those double shifts to pay the mortgage on the house Savannah hated, and to pay off the credit card debt Savannah constantly accrued, trying to look like the women she sold perfume to. He works hard, Sav, Emily said quietly. Working hard doesn't pay for a new boiler, Savannah retorted, sliding her credit card into the chip reader. I just need a little treat, something to make this week bearable. At that moment, Savannah's phone, resting on the edge of the conveyor belt, buzzed. The screen lit up. From her angle behind the register, Emily couldn't help but see the notification banner. Marcus, hotel bar at 7. Wear something I can take off easily. The air in Emily's lungs turned to ice. She stared at the glowing screen, then looked up at her sister. Savannah snatched the phone with a practiced, casual swiftness, a small, secret smile pulling at the corner of her lips. She didn't look guilty. She looked thrilled. Have a good night, Em, Savannah said cheerfully, grabbing the double-bagged wine and her gourmet groceries. Try not to work yourself to death. Emily watched her sister walk out through the automatic sliding doors, her hips swaying slightly as she headed toward the parking lot. The receipt tape fluttered from the machine, a long white ribbon detailing $68 of unearned luxury. A sickening realization settled deep in Emily's stomach. The complaints about the cold house, the disdain for Harrison's exhaustion, it wasn't just frustration, it was an alibi. Savannah was building a narrative to justify her own rot. She was turning Harrison into a negligent villain so she could play the neglected victim, all while sipping expensive wine in a hotel room with a man named Marcus. Emily crumpled the receipt in her hand. Blood is thicker than water, their mother used to say. But as Emily thought about Harrison, standing over a hot grill at 3 in the morning to afford the very life Savannah was throwing away, she realized that some blood was just toxic. She couldn't unsee the text. She couldn't unknow the truth. She looked up at the clock on the wall. Her shift ended at 10. Harrison would be at the diner until dawn. Emily tossed the crumpled receipt into the trash bin beneath the register. She wasn't going to let Savannah destroy him in the dark. The sky above Cleveland was the color of a bruised plum by the time Harrison finally untied his grease-stained apron. It was 6 in the morning on Wednesday, and the graveyard shift had drained whatever adrenaline remained in his system. The diner was empty save for Marge, who was silently counting singles at the register, and Emily. She was sitting in a corner booth, her heavy winter coat still on, staring into a mug of coffee that had stopped steaming an hour ago. She hadn't said a word since she walked in at 5:30, simply taking a seat and waiting for the rhythmic scraping of the grill to stop. Harrison poured 2 fresh cups of dark roast and slid into the vinyl booth across from her. The Formica table was cold against his forearms. You should be asleep, Harrison said, his voice a low rasp. So should you, Emily replied, her gaze lifting to meet his. Her eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the deep purple of exhaustion. She didn't offer a polite smile. She came into the store yesterday afternoon, bought a $60 bottle of Cabernet and a tin of imported prosciutto, complained about how cold your house is and how you're never there. Harrison looked down at his black coffee, watching his own distorted reflection on the surface. He felt the familiar, crushing weight of shame pressed down on his chest. He was a man who couldn't keep his wife warm, couldn't keep her happy, and couldn't even pretend he didn't know why. I saw a text, Emily continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The silence in the diner seemed to amplify her words. A man named Marcus. He told her to meet him at a hotel bar, told her to wear something he could take off easily. Harrison closed his eyes. The name Marcus landed like a physical blow, a sharp, jagged stone sinking into the hollow of his stomach. It was one thing to suspect, to see the signs and read vague messages. It was entirely another to hear the name of the man dismantling his life, spoken aloud by his own family. "I know," Harrison breathed out, the words tasting like ash. "I've known for a few weeks." Emily didn't gasp. She didn't offer pity, which Harrison was profoundly grateful for. Pity would have broken him. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her raw, cracked hands flat on the table. "What are you going to do, Harry? File for divorce? Let her drag you through mediation so she can cry about being emotionally neglected to a judge while she sleeps with a guy who wears tailored coats?" "I don't know," Harrison admitted, staring at the scarred table. "I don't have the money for a lawyer, Em, and I don't have the energy for a war." "Then we don't go to war," Emily said quietly. A hard, resolute glint caught in her tired eyes. "Wars are loud. She expects loud. If you scream, she gets to be the victim. She gets to tell her friends that you were angry, unhinged, unstable. We don't give her that." Harrison looked up, searching her face. "Then what do? We take away the floor," Emily said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "She's built this fantasy life because she knows you're always going to be there to pay the mortgage, fix the boiler, and keep the lights on. She's floating because you're her anchor. So, you stop being the anchor. You don't yell, you don't confront, you just withdraw. Let her feel the weight of her own choices. Let the air out of the room." The neon open sign buzzed against the window pane. Harrison looked at his sister-in-law, seeing the same quiet devastation in her posture that he felt in his own bones. It wasn't a pact born of malice, but of a desperate need for survival. He reached across the table, his scarred, grease-burned fingers briefly touching hers. It was an agonizing, silent agreement. The illusion was over. Now, the dismantling would begin. It started on Thursday morning with the coffee machine. For 6 years, regardless of how exhausted he was from the night shift, Harrison had programmed the old Hamilton Beach drip maker to brew Savannah's expensive hazelnut roast at exactly 7:30. It was an invisible tax he gladly paid, a daily, silent declaration that he was looking out for her. Today, the glass pot was bone dry. The hardest part hadn't been the decision to stop. It had been fighting the ingrained muscle memory of his devotion. When Harrison had walked into the kitchen at 6:40, his hand had automatically reached for the crinkling foil bag of her gourmet beans. He had stood there in the dim kitchen for a long minute, his chest tightening with a pathetic urge to just make the damn coffee, to preserve the fragile peace of his own ignorance. But Emily's voice had echoed in his mind. Take away the floor. Harrison had set the bag down, grabbed his cheap instant grounds, and made a single, bitter cup just for himself. At 7:40, Savannah stepped out of the bedroom, shivering in her thin silk robe. The house felt unusually frigid. The thermostat, which Harrison always nudged up before she woke to take the harsh Ohio winter bite out of the air, remained firmly set at 62 degrees. She walked into the kitchen, rubbing her bare arms, expecting the familiar, comforting aroma. She stopped, staring at the empty burner. Harrison was sitting at the small dining table. He was wearing his heavy flannel shirt, slowly eating a bowl of oatmeal. "Did the machine break?" Savannah asked, her voice raspy with sleep, a hint of habitual annoyance already threading through it. Harrison took a slow bite of oatmeal. He didn't look up immediately. He let the silence stretch, letting it fill the small, chilly kitchen. "No," he finally said, his tone perfectly even. "Just didn't make a full pot today." Savannah frowned, her brow furrowing. It was a minuscule deviation, trivial even, but it unsettled her, like reaching for a handrail in the dark and finding empty space. She huffed, turning abruptly toward the bathroom to shower. 10 minutes later, the hot water was shut off. Usually, on these freezing mornings, Harrison would throw her towel in the dryer while she bathed, leaving a cocoon of warmth waiting for her on the rack. Today, the towel was stiff and icy against her damp skin. The cold seeped into her bones, sharper and more invasive than usual. When she returned to the bedroom to dress for her shift at Dillard's, she found her car keys exactly where she had dropped them on the dresser the night before. He hadn't gone out to start her sedan. He hadn't scraped the thick sheet of frost off the windshield. Fully dressed in her tailored black uniform, smelling heavily of bergamot and vanilla, she walked back into the living room. The unease in her chest was no longer a brief flicker. It was a steady, cold hum of anxiety. "Harry, are you sure you're okay?" she asked, stopping a few feet from the table. You're acting strange. Harrison finally lifted his head and looked at her. He studied her face, the elegant bone structure, the perfectly applied mascara, the immaculate facade she spent hours constructing for a world he wasn't part of. Before yesterday, looking at her would have evoked a desperate need to ensure she was happy, a fear that he wasn't providing enough. Now, sitting securely behind the psychological wall Emily had helped him build, he just saw the stranger who was meeting a man named Marcus in a hotel room tonight. "I'm fine, Savannah," Harrison said. His voice wasn't angry, it wasn't passive-aggressive, it was terrifyingly polite. It was the voice a bank teller uses with a stranger. "Just tired. Have a good shift." He stood up, rinsed his bowl in the sink, and walked past her toward the bedroom. He didn't brush her shoulder. He didn't pause for the habitual lifeless goodbye kiss they usually exchanged near the door. Savannah stood entirely alone in the center of the cramped living room, clutching her cold car keys. The silence he left in his wake wasn't the heavy, volatile quiet of an unsaid argument. It was something entirely different. It was the vast, echoing emptiness of an abandoned house. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, realizing with a sudden, inexplicable dread that the solid ground beneath her feet was quietly giving way. Friday evenings at the Giant Eagle were a chaotic symphony of rattling shopping carts, crying toddlers, and the monotonous beeping of registers. Emily was assigned to restock the wine aisle, pulling heavy glass bottles from cardboard boxes and lining them up on the metal shelving. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unflattering glare on the scuffed linoleum floor. It was there, between the imported Italian reds and the domestic blends, that she saw him. He matched Harrison's description perfectly. A man in his late 30s, wearing a tailored charcoal overcoat that looked entirely out of place among the puffy winter jackets of the Friday grocery crowd. He had the relaxed, unhurried posture of a man who never had to worry about the price tag of what he was picking up. He stood before the Napa Valley Cabernets, his brow slightly furrowed as he examined a label, a heavy silver watch glinting on his wrist. Emily felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline in her chest. She wiped her raw hands on her green uniform apron, took a deep breath, and stepped into his periphery, deliberately dropping a flattened cardboard box near his polished leather shoes. "Oh, excuse me," Emily said, feigning a startled, tired smile as she bent to retrieve it. The man stepped back, offering a polite, distant nod. "No problem at all." Emily stood up, looking at him closely, allowing a flicker of recognition to cross her face. She tilts her head, narrowing her eyes just enough to make him pause. "Wait, you're Marcus, aren't you?" The man stiffened. The polite detachment vanished, replaced instantly by a guarded, defensive wariness. He looked around the aisle, suddenly hyper-aware of his surroundings. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "I'm Emily," she said, her voice dropping to a warm, conspiratorial whisper. She extended a rough, calloused hand. "Savannah's sister. I saw a picture of you two on her phone." Marcus hesitated before shaking her hand. His grip was brief and tense. "Savannah didn't mention her sister worked here." "Savannah doesn't like to mention a lot of things," Emily replied, letting out a soft, sympathetic sigh. She leaned against the metal shelving, crossing her arms. "Look, I just wanted to say, thank you. Seriously." Marcus frowned, his confusion deepening. "Thank you for what?" Emily looked at him with wide, earnest eyes, playing the role of the oblivious, oversharing sibling with practiced perfection. "For being there for her. For helping her out. Things have been so incredibly dark at the house lately, with the foreclosure notices and the credit cards being maxed out. Harrison is working himself to death on the night shift, just to keep the lights on, but it's not enough. Savannah has been spiraling. She's terrified." Marcus's expression shifted. The romantic, careless luster of his secret affair was suddenly being dragged through the mud of suburban debt and marital collapse. "Foreclosure?" he repeated, the word tasting sour in his mouth. "Oh, she hasn't told you?" Emily gasped softly, covering her mouth with her fingers, looking genuinely horrified. "Oh God, please don't tell her I said anything. She's so proud. She likes to pretend she lives this high-end life, buying all these expensive perfumes and clothes. But the debt is crushing them. I think you're her escape plan, Marcus. She talks about you like you're the only way she's going to survive this bankruptcy without losing her mind." Emily watched the exact moment the illusion shattered in Marcus's eyes. He wasn't a knight in shining armor rescuing a neglected, elegant housewife anymore. In the harsh fluorescent light of the supermarket, he suddenly realized he was the target of a desperate, financially ruined woman looking for a bailout. The passion, the stolen afternoons in hotel rooms, it all instantly felt calculated, heavy, and incredibly messy. I had no idea, Marcus murmured, taking a subtle step back, creating physical distance between himself and Emily, and by extension, Savannah's chaotic reality. Just take care of her, Emily pleaded gently, stepping back to her cart. She really needs someone to pay attention to her right now. Have a good evening, Marcus. Emily turned and walked down the aisle, the wheels of her cart squeaking rhythmically. She didn't look back, but she could hear the distinct sound of Marcus placing the expensive bottle of Cabernet back onto the shelf before his polished shoes hurried away toward the exit. The screen of Savannah's iPhone remained black, a shiny, mocking rectangle sitting on the edge of the bathroom sink. It had been 24 hours since she last heard from Marcus. Her last 3 text messages had been marked "Read" late Friday night, followed by a deafening, agonizing silence. He had never ignored her before. Usually, their weekends were filled with a steady drip of clandestine, flirtatious messages while Harrison slept off his night shifts. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, aggressively wiping a smudge of expensive mascara from beneath her lower lash line. Her chest felt tight, bound by a thin, invisible wire of panic. The thrill of the affair was entirely dependent on its effortless escape. Without Marcus's reassuring replies, the fantasy was evaporating, leaving her stranded in the reality she despised. She walked out into the living room, pulling her cashmere cardigan tightly around her shoulders. The house was, as always, too cold. Harrison was sitting on the worn fabric sofa. He wasn't asleep, which was unusual for a Saturday evening before his shift. He was simply reading a paperback novel, the dim glow of a floor lamp casting long shadows across the burn scars on his forearms. He looked peaceful. The sight of his calm, unbothered posture grated against her frayed nerves. She needed noise. She needed friction. She needed him to care enough to fight. "Did you even look at the mail today?" Savannah asked, her voice sharper than intended, slicing through the quiet room. She walked over to the small console table and picked up a stack of envelopes, waving a final notice from a credit card company. "Because this just came again. Are we just going to pretend we aren't drowning?" A week ago, this would have triggered a familiar, exhausted cycle. Harrison would have apologized, rubbed his temples, and promised to pick up an extra shift. He would have taken the burden onto his own shoulders, desperate to soothe her anxiety. Today, Harrison didn't even put his book down. He simply marked his page with his thumb and looked up at her. His eyes were clear, polite, and completely devoid of guilt. "I saw it," Harrison said evenly. "I'll call them on Monday and set up a payment plan with what's left from my check." Savannah froze, her hand gripping the envelope. The absolute lack of defensiveness threw her off balance. "That's it? You'll just call them?" "Harrison, this is humiliating. I work in a high-end store. I have to look a certain way, and I can't even afford to put gas in my car without checking my account balance first. Doesn't that bother you?" She took a step closer, projecting her escalating panic onto him, pushing for a crack in his serene facade. She wanted him to yell. She wanted him to demand to know why she bought so many clothes, to accuse her of being selfish. Anything that proved he was still invested in the messy, painful reality of their marriage. Harrison looked at her face, truly looking at the subtle tremor in her jaw, the wide, frightened look in her eyes. Emily's plan was working flawlessly. The floor was gone. "It bothers me, Savannah," Harrison replied, his voice maintaining the steady, detached cadence of a customer service representative. "I work as many hours as I physically can. But you're right, it's not enough. If this life is too hard for you, I understand." He opened his book again and went back to reading. Savannah stood rooted to the worn carpet. The silence that followed was louder than any screaming match they could have had. "I understand." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a promise to do better. It was an open door, held casually ajar by a man who no longer cared if she walked through it. She looked at her husband, sitting quietly under the lamplight, and then glanced back toward the dark hallway where her silent phone lay. For the first time in her life, Savannah realized she was entirely alone in the room, even with him sitting right there. The safety net hadn't just been lowered, it had been quietly, methodically cut away. The industrial dryers at the Wash and Dry on 4th Street hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration that rattled the loose change on the folding tables. It was 2 in the morning on a Sunday. Outside, a fresh layer of lake-effect snow was burying Cleveland under a blanket of pristine, freezing white. Inside, the air smelled heavily of bleach, artificial lavender, and damp wool. Harrison sat in a molded plastic chair, watching his heavy denim work shirts tumble endlessly behind the thick, scratched glass of machine number 12. He had started doing his own laundry 3 days ago, another quiet severing of the domestic ties he shared with Savannah. The glass door of the laundromat pushed open, letting in a swirl of icy wind. Emily stepped inside, stomping the snow off her boots. She wore an oversized gray beanie and a dark green parka, her cheeks flushed red from the cold. In her gloved hands, she carried 2 styrofoam cups of coffee from the Speedway gas station across the street. She didn't ask if the seat next to him was taken. She simply walked over, sank into the hard plastic chair, and handed him one of the cups. "Black, no sugar," she said softly, her voice slightly muffled by her thick woolen scarf. "Thanks," Harrison murmured, taking the cup. The styrofoam was scalding hot, a welcome contrast to the chill seeping through the cracked windows. They didn't immediately talk about Savannah. They rarely did anymore. The plan was already in motion. The floor had been pulled out, and all that was left was to watch the inevitable collapse. Instead, they existed in the heavy, comfortable silence that only 2 deeply exhausted people could share. "My manager asked me to take the graveyard shift, restocking produce next month," Emily said after a while, staring at the spinning laundry. "An extra $2 an hour. You going to take it?" Harrison asked, taking a slow sip of the bitter, burnt gas station coffee. "Probably. The daytime crowds are getting to me. I think I prefer the quiet." She turned her head, looking at him. "How do you do it, Harry? 6 years of just nights." "You stop fighting it eventually," he replied, his gaze fixed on the dryer. "You just accept that you live in a different time zone than the rest of the world. It's lonelier, but it's honest." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to his hands. They were wrapped tightly around the white cup, the knuckles scarred from grease burns, the skin dry and cracked from the winter air. They were the hands of a man who had built a life out of pure, unglamorous effort, only to have it secretly dismantled by the woman he built it for. Without thinking, Emily reached out. She gently placed her gloved hand over his wrist. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an anchor. It was a physical acknowledgement of the profound, crushing weight they were both carrying. Harrison went perfectly still. He felt the warmth of her hand through the heavy canvas of his jacket sleeve. For a fleeting, dangerous second, the profound isolation that had been drowning him for weeks cracked. He looked at Emily. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the raw redness of her own overworked hands, the fierce, uncompromising loyalty that her sister entirely lacked. The air between them grew thick, charged with the sudden realization of how easy it would be to lean in. How easy it would be to find solace in the one person who truly understood the betrayal. But Harrison didn't move, and Emily didn't pull him closer. They both recognized the boundary, sitting there under the harsh fluorescent lights of the laundromat. To cross it would be to become the very thing they despised. It would validate Savannah's choices, turning their shared, righteous grief into just another dirty suburban secret. Slowly, deliberately, Emily withdrew her hand, wrapping both of her arms around her own coffee cup. Harrison exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, relaxing back into the plastic chair. The boundary held, solid and unyielding. They weren't lovers. They were 2 survivors, sitting side by side in the wreckage, finding a solitary, melancholy peace in the fact that, for the first time in a long time, neither of them was alone in the dark. Savannah's hands were trembling slightly. She pressed them flat against the cold marble table of the artisanal cafe just outside the mall, hoping Marcus wouldn't notice the tremor. It was 1:15 on a Tuesday. She had spent half her lunch break pacing the promenade before finally spotting him walking out of a nearby financial building. She had practically ambushed him on the sidewalk, desperation overriding her usual practiced elegance. Marcus sat across from her, his posture rigid and withdrawn. He hadn't bothered to take off his tailored charcoal overcoat. His untouched espresso sat between them like a physical barricade. "You haven't been answering my texts," Savannah said, forcing a light, breathy tone that sounded entirely unconvincing to her own ears. She offered a smile that felt brittle, threatening to crack her carefully applied makeup. "I thought maybe you lost your phone, or that I did something wrong." Marcus looked at her. It wasn't the heavy, lingering gaze that used to make her feel expensive and desired. His eyes were entirely analytical, sweeping over her voluminous hair and her sleek Dillard's uniform, but seeing right through the expensive veneer. "I've been busy, Savannah," he replied, his voice devoid of its usual warm, conspiratorial cadence. "Work has been demanding." "Too demanding for a 5-minute drink?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly. The scent of vanilla and bergamot wafted from her collar, a perfume she had applied specifically for him. "We could get a room at the Westin tonight, just for an hour. I need to get out of that house, Marcus. Harrison is driving me completely insane. He's acting like a ghost." She expected the familiar flash of illicit thrill in his eyes. She expected him to nod, to reach across the small table and touch her hand, validating her complaints about her dreary, suffocating suburban life. Instead, Marcus subtly pulled his hand back, resting it on his knee beneath the table. "How is Harrison?" Marcus asked quietly. The question landed in the space between them like a lead weight. Savannah blinked, completely caught off guard. "What? Why are you asking about him? He's fine. He's just working his miserable diner shifts." "Is he?" Marcus tilted his head, his expression hardening into something resembling profound pity. And pity was the absolute last thing Savannah wanted from him. She wanted his lust. "Because I heard he's working double shifts just to keep your house out of foreclosure." The air in Savannah's lungs vanished. The bustling noise of the cafe, the grinding espresso machines, the sharp clatter of saucers, the low hum of business meetings, faded into a high-pitched ring. The blood drained from her face. Who told you that?" "It doesn't matter," Marcus said, glancing at his heavy silver watch. The gesture was casually dismissive and entirely final. "Look, Savannah, whatever this was between us, it was supposed to be fun, an escape, but I don't do messy, and I certainly don't do financial rescue missions." "Rescue mission?" Savannah's voice broke, the polished facade cracking wide open to reveal the raw, terrified panic beneath. "Marcus, no, that's not what this is. I don't need your money. I just need you. I just need a place where I don't feel like I'm drowning." "You need an escape hatch," he corrected coldly. He stood up, adjusting the lapels of his overcoat. He didn't look angry. He looked burdened, exhausted by her mere presence. "I'm not it. You have a husband who is killing himself on a grill to pay for the clothes you're wearing right now. Maybe you should go home and figure that out." He turned and walked toward the exit, seamlessly merging into the stream of affluent professionals on the sidewalk outside. He didn't look back. Savannah sat frozen in the plush cafe booth. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window pane. She looked exactly the same, elegant, put together, fragrant. But inside, the architecture of her denial was collapsing in real time. The thrilling, cinematic romance she thought she was starring in was just a cheap, ugly cliché, and Marcus had just read the script. She looked down at her glowing phone screen on the marble table, realizing with a sickening dread that she had nowhere left to run. The fantasy had violently rejected her. The only place left to go was a quiet, freezing house with a husband who had stopped making her coffee, a husband whose silence was suddenly far more terrifying than his anger ever could have been. The heater in Savannah's aged sedan rattled as it struggled against the biting Ohio wind. The drive from the upscale shopping district back to their cramped suburban neighborhood usually took 20 minutes, but tonight, every mile felt like a slow descent into a grave she had dug herself. Marcus's words played on a relentless, agonizing loop in her mind. "I don't do financial rescue missions." He hadn't just ended the affair, he had stripped her of the glamorous, tragic heroine narrative she had carefully constructed, exposing her as nothing more than a desperate woman trying to escape her own life. She pulled into the cracked concrete driveway of their home. The snow had piled up, thick and unbothered. Harrison hadn't shoveled it. For the first time in 6 winters, she had to step carefully through the freezing, ankle-deep slush in her expensive leather heels, the icy water seeping through the seams. She unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house was dark save for the dim, yellowish light spilling from the small kitchen at the back of the hallway. Savannah dropped her heavy leather handbag onto the floor with a deliberate, echoing thud. She wanted to announce her presence. She wanted the familiar sound of heavy footsteps, the immediate, concerned voice of her husband asking what was wrong. She wanted the suffocating, predictable devotion she had spent the last 2 years resenting. Silence answered her. She walked slowly down the hallway, the damp hem of her trousers clinging coldly to her ankles. When she reached the kitchen threshold, she stopped. Harrison was sitting at the small dining table. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt, methodically polishing his heavy, steel-toed work boots with a rag and a tin of cheap wax. The smell of the chemical polish mixed with the faint, lingering scent of boiled pasta. It was a fiercely blue-collar tableau, exactly the sort of gritty reality she used to flee to hotel bars to avoid. But tonight, it looked like a life raft. "Harry," she whispered. Her voice trembled, raw and pathetic. Harrison didn't pause his rhythmic polishing. He looked up, his eyes catching the harsh overhead light. There was no hostility in his gaze. There was no pity either. He looked at her the way one looks at a stranger who has asked for directions in a city they don't know. "You're home late," he noted evenly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the old refrigerator. Savannah crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly feeling completely exposed despite her heavy coat. "I had a terrible day. It was awful, Harry." She waited for the invitation. She waited for him to stand up, to pull out a chair, to offer a cup of tea or a warm towel. Harrison simply dipped his rag back into the tin of wax. "I'm sorry to hear that. The weather makes the roads bad. You should get out of those wet shoes." He went back to his boots. Savannah stood frozen on the cheap linoleum floor. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact in months. She felt the solid, warm muscle beneath his t-shirt. She squeezed, a desperate, silent plea for him to look at her, to see her falling apart, to catch her. Harrison stopped polishing. He didn't flinch away from her touch, but he didn't lean into it either. He sat perfectly still, a statue of a man who had already grieved the death of his marriage in the dark, long before the corpse had realized it was dead. Slowly, Harrison reached up with his clean hand. He didn't hold her fingers. He simply lifted her hand off his shoulder, gently placing it back at her side, as if removing a leaf that had fallen on his jacket. "I need to finish this before my shift," he said quietly, picking up the rag again. Savannah stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The physical rejection was incredibly gentle, which made it infinitely more devastating than a scream or a slap. She looked around the small kitchen, at the peeling wallpaper and the empty coffee pot. For 8 years, this tiny, drafty house had been a fortress of unconditional love, built entirely on Harrison's back. Now, looking at the calm, impenetrable profile of her husband, Savannah realized the horrifying truth. The fortress was still standing, but the gates were locked, and she was entirely on the outside. Savannah stared at Harrison's back as he stood up from the small dining table, securely capping the tin of cheap boot polish. The rhythmic, scraping sound that had anchored the room stopped, leaving a heavy vacuum in the kitchen. That silence was instantly filled by a deafening roar in Savannah's own ears. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the drafty suburban house felt like they were actively shrinking, pressing in on the massive, rotting secret she had been dragging around for months. "Harrison," she gasped out. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a fractured, ugly sound, ripped from the very bottom of her throat. He paused, his hand resting casually on the edge of the stainless steel sink, but he didn't turn around. The dam broke. The polished, elegant veneer of the Dillard's perfume counter completely washed away, leaving behind a terrified, drowning woman with wet, freezing feet. "I did something," she choked out, her entire body trembling violently beneath her heavy coat. "Harry, I haven't been working late. The extra shifts, the dinners with the girls. It was all a lie." She waited for him to spin around. She braced herself for the sudden shock, the furious denial, the sound of a heart shattering. Harrison turned on the faucet. The water ran in a steady, thin stream. He reached for a bar of soap and began methodically washing the black wax from his calloused knuckles. "His name is Marcus," Savannah sobbed, the tears hot and fast down her cheeks, smearing her expensive mascara into dark, muddy streaks. "I met him at the mall. We've been going to a hotel downtown. I'm so sorry, God, Harry. I am so sorry. It meant nothing. It was just an escape from everything. From the bills, from the cold, from this. She sank into one of the hard wooden dining chairs, covering her face with her damp, trembling hands. She let out heavy, heaving sobs that echoed pathetically off the peeling floral wallpaper. She was offering him the knife. She needed him to take it. She needed him to yell, to curse at her, to throw a ceramic plate against the wall. Anything that proved her existence still mattered enough to inflict pain upon him. The water shut off. Harrison dried his hands slowly on a faded dish towel. He draped the cloth over the oven handle and finally turned to face her. His expression was utterly serene. His eyes were a dull, impenetrable gray, entirely devoid of the violent grief she was begging for. "I know," he said softly. Savannah froze. Her breath hitched painfully in her chest, her hands slowly falling away from her tear-streaked face. The silence in the room suddenly felt lethal. "What? I know," Harrison repeated, his voice carrying the same casual, measured weight as if he were confirming he had paid the electric bill. "I've known for almost a month. The night you left your iPad on the kitchen island, he texted you about the red dress, the silk one I bought you for our anniversary." Savannah stared at him, a profound, paralyzing horror slowly blossoming in her chest, freezing the tears on her face. You knew?" "Yes. For a month?" Her voice was a hollow, breathless whisper. "But you didn't say anything. You just kept making me dinner. You just kept making my coffee and warming my towels and—" "Until I didn't," Harrison finished for her. The realization hit Savannah with the blunt force of a physical blow. The sudden lack of coffee, the freezing mornings, the utterly indifferent stares when she complained about their debts. It hadn't been a phase. It hadn't been male exhaustion. It had been a quiet, calculated execution. He hadn't been oblivious to her affair. He had been watching her flaunt it, and he had systematically dismantled the safety net she didn't even realize she was standing on. "Why didn't you scream at me?" she begged, her voice cracking as she slid out of the chair, her knees hitting the cold linoleum floor. "Why didn't you confront me? Why didn't you throw me out?" Harrison looked down at her. He didn't see the beautiful, sophisticated woman he had worshipped for 8 years. He just saw a stranger on the floor, begging for a warmth he had already repossessed. "Because you aren't worth the noise, Savannah," Harrison said, his voice terrifyingly gentle. "You wanted a different life. You can have it now." He picked up his freshly polished steel-toed boots, stepped carefully around her kneeling form, and walked down the dim hallway toward their bedroom to pack. Harrison pulled the heavy, olive-green canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of the bedroom closet. The zipper caught slightly on the worn fabric, a harsh, metallic sound that cut through the dead silence of the house. He packed exactly as he lived, practically, quietly, and without excess. 5 faded t-shirts, 2 pairs of heavy denim jeans, thick wool socks, and his shaving kit. He bypassed the expensive cologne Savannah had bought him 3 Christmases ago, leaving it untouched on the dresser next to her array of crystal perfume bottles. Savannah stood in the doorway. She was still wearing the damp trousers and the cashmere sweater from the night before, her hair tangled, her makeup permanently smudged into the hollows beneath her eyes. She looked small, stripped of the manufactured luxury that usually armored her. "Where are you going?" she asked. Her voice was thin, completely drained of the theatrical panic from the kitchen. It was the voice of a woman who finally understood that the play was over and the audience had gone home. Harrison didn't look up. He folded a flannel shirt and pressed it into the corner of the bag. "I'll stay at a motel off the interstate for a few days. Then I'll find an apartment closer to the diner." "How are we going to pay for this?" she whispered, staring at the empty spaces he was leaving in the closet. "The house? The mortgage?" "I'll keep paying half the mortgage until we sell it," Harrison replied evenly, pulling the zipper shut with a decisive yank. He hoisted the heavy strap over his shoulder. "The rest of your debt is yours, Savannah. You wanted to live like you were rich. Now you have to figure out how to afford it." He walked toward the doorway. She didn't move to block him. She shrank back against the doorframe, wrapping her arms around her stomach, as if physically trying to hold herself together. Harrison stopped just inches from her. For a fraction of a second, the instinct that had governed the last 8 years of his life flared up. The urge to reach out, to touch her hair, to promise her that he would fix it. But he looked at her face and felt absolutely nothing. The well was entirely dry. He walked past her, down the narrow hallway, and through the living room. He placed his house key on the small console table by the front door. The metal clinked softly against the wood. Without looking back, Harrison opened the front door, stepped out into the freezing Ohio morning, and pulled the door shut behind him. The click of the lock was final. The air outside was biting, sharp with the scent of impending snow and exhaust from the distant freeway. Harrison adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, his steel-toed boots crunching loudly against the frozen crust of the driveway. He didn't look back at the house. The crushing weight that had been sitting on his chest for a month was suddenly gone, replaced by a cold, expansive emptiness that felt remarkably like freedom. He walked 3 blocks down to the RTA bus stop on the corner of 117th Street. The sky above Cleveland was beginning to turn a bruised, pale gray. The streetlights buzzed overhead, flickering as they prepared to shut off for the day. Sitting on the icy metal bench under the plexiglass shelter was Emily. She wore her heavy green parka and the oversized beanie, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Next to her sat 2 styrofoam cups of Speedway coffee. She didn't look surprised to see him carrying a duffel bag. She simply picked up one of the cups and held it out as he approached. Harrison stopped under the shelter, setting his heavy bag on the concrete. He took the cup. The heat radiated through the cheap foam, warming his bare, scarred hands. "Black, no sugar," she said quietly. "Thank you," Harrison murmured, taking a slow sip. They stood side by side, looking out at the empty, snow-covered avenue. There was no grand romantic declaration. There was no cinematic embrace to signal a new beginning. They were simply 2 exhausted, blue-collar workers standing in the freezing cold, drinking burnt coffee at the dawn of a new day. But as the heavy diesel engine of the early morning bus roared in the distance, cutting through the silence, Harrison looked over at Emily. She met his gaze, offering a small, weary, completely honest nod. The lies were dead. The house was empty. And for the first time in a very long time, Harrison Pemberton felt entirely awake.